Welcome, guys. Today we're going to be looking at community ecology. So, kind of motoring along. Last time we had a talk, it was about ecosystem ecology. So today we're going to be looking at what we call community ecology. And first thing we want to do is just go ahead and define what a community is. So we'll get you a definition for this here. So community is going to be all the populations of organisms which essentially are what we call biotic factors. Abiotic factors would be the non-living things. So we're looking at just the living parts of a place, right? All the living populations in a certain area. So in this picture here, we're looking at this bear and this salmon with the grasses and the different invertebrates in the shoreline there, any of the insects. This would be an example of a community. So everything pictured here that's living would be part of this particular community. And within communities, organisms tend to have something called a niche. So we're going to go ahead and define what that is. And the niche is going to be the role or the responsibility an organism has in its environment. And oftentimes this will include kind of the interactions that take place within that community. And what we can see is something called niche partitioning. So when we break up a larger niche into smaller pieces, it can reduce competition. So niche partitioning is when you break up a niche, a bigger niche into smaller ones, and you can reduce the competition. So you can reduce the competition by specializing. Here's an example of niche partitioning. So the niche here would be this bird, this avian species that feeds on invertebrates or animals, organisms that dwell right here on the intertidal zone. So a flamingo is going to only use part of the niche. It's going to act as kind of a filter and sift through the sand there with its long legs touching the bottom. It's going to dip its head down and sift through and look for small invertebrates or crustaceans that it's going to eat. The duck, on the other hand, is going to float on the surface and bob down and try to find different species of things to eat off the surface of the sand. That's not really going to dig. The avocet is going to look at a shallower section of the niche. It's going to again walk in the water and just look to uncover anything that's in that particular area. The oyster catcher is going to dig in the sand on the actual beachhead and not in the water. And then the plover is just going to pick crabs or whatever it can find on the coast there as well. So again, this is a larger niche that's been broken into smaller sections, partitioned to reduce competition by specializing. So move along, we're going to talk about some of these relationships and these interactions that we included up here above. So we're going to look at some symbiotic relationships. And the first one that we're going to look at is what we call mutualism. Mutualism, and this is going to be a relationship where both species receive some sort of benefit from the relationship. So here we have a classic example of mutualism, where you have the sea anemone providing shelter from predators for clownfish that have immunity to the stinging nematocysts of the sea anemone. And then what the clownfish will do is they will run off butterfly fish and other varieties of fish that actually like to eat the nematocyst tentacles of the sea anemone. So both are providing a type of protection against some predatory fish. So this would be an example of mutualism where they're both benefiting from this relationship. So again, let's make a note of the example here because it is a common one. And this is the clownfish and this anemone. Here's another example where we have this crocodile species and this bird. And again, there's a mutualistic relationship here where the crocodile is going to eat something. It's going to have leftover bits and pieces in its mouth, and this bird is going to pick kind of that stuff clean from the crocodile's mouth and remove the detritus that will provide additional hygiene benefit for the crocodile. So this would be a type of mutualistic relationship where they're both benefiting. So second type of symbiotic relationship here is what we call parasitism, where one species benefits at the other's expense. So we'll get a look at this example. So here we have the classic case of a tick. This is a dog tick and a human host, right? The tick is going to quest and stick its arms up on an extended piece of grass to try to latch on to anything that walks by. And then it's going to look for a moist, warm area to try to bed down and embed into the skin of the organism so it can take a blood meal. It'll become enlarged and then fall off and continue its life cycle. But it can spread diseases, Lyme disease, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, different tick-borne diseases exist, so it's important that you check and make sure you don't have any of these guys on you when you walk through the timber or tall grass. So that would be a parasitic relationship, the tick deriving benefit at the host, the human's expense in this case. Again, we'll just make a note of that interaction here. So we have a tick and some sort of mammal. And then we'll look at relationship number 3. We call this a commensal or a commensalistic relationship. So commensalism. So commensalism. And one benefits and the other is unaffected. Or someone indifferent. So the example here is a lemon shark and the remora. And the remora just kind of suctions to the lemon shark and will go where it goes. And when the lemon shark takes a meal, the remoras can detach and clean up the scraps. So shark really isn't impacted in any way negatively. So this is more of a commensalistic or commensalism type relationship. So again, we'll make a note of this. We'll say the shark and the remora are an example of this commensalism relationship. Other examples of different types of community level, community ecology interactions would be predator-prey, which you're going to be already pretty familiar with. So predation, and again, we talked earlier about niche partitioning and how that reduces competition, but we'll just make a note of that as well. So those are other community level interactions. So predation and competition are going to be things that you want to be aware of, but not necessarily something we need to really dig too deep into. If we look at, predation and this predator-prey dynamic that we see here with lynx and hare, we see that typically there's a lag time between when the hare population spikes and then the predator population will spike afterwards. So we have this cycling that occurs with a little bit of lag time between the two groups. So we see that quite a bit when you're talking about a predator-prey type relationship. From there, we're going to look at what we call diversity. So community diversity, or in terms of ecology diversity. And diversity in terms of ecology is species richness. So species richness, an abundance of different species essentially is what we're looking at. Abundance of different species. And we'll look at a good example of this in the impact. All right, so here we have two communities, community one and community two. And community one has a 25% distribution of 4 types of trees. So quite diverse in terms of species richness. Community two has the same 4 varieties of trees, but it's much more heavily weighted with the variety A tree. Now, what we see here is this community is going to be less stable, and community one will be more stable because if you have some sort of disease or issue that impacts species A, in community one, you're still going to have 75% of your species composition will be intact. But in community two, you're only going to have 20% of your species remaining if something were to happen to species A. An example of this that we'll look at is what's going on with our ash trees and this invasive species called the emerald ash borer. And you can see it's kind of moving from the northeast down to the Ohio Valley River area, and the risk is becoming quite high. And what these beetles do is, or these borers do, these emerald ash borers, is they basically destroy your ash trees. So if species A in our communities are ash trees, community two is going to face significant disruption and the stability just isn't going to be there. Where in community one, you would still have 75% of your species intact if your A is representing this ash tree. So again, the greater diversity you have in species richness, the more likely it is that you're going to be able to resist instability. So what we'll say here is that if we increase the diversity, we can increase the community stability. And there's a way to actually calculate this. You don't need to know this. It's called the Simpson's Diversity Index. And it's a formula where you can actually quantify the diversity index of a particular community. Next thing we're going to look at are what we call trophic levels. And a trophic level is just a feeding step. So it's a step in a food chain. And there's something called a trophic cascade, where if you remove a trophic level, you could see a whole host of downstream effects on some of the other trophic levels that are on top of or connected to that trophic level. So let's get a look at this. So here's an example of trophic levels, and we'll zoom out just a touch here for you. Um, but each level represents a trophic level, a feeding step, or a step in a food chain or a food web. And what we want to see here is we're looking at these kcal values, and we're seeing a 10% energy transfer between the trophic levels. So we're going to sketch this out and just kind of talk through it. So I'm going to start my energy pyramid here at the bottom of the page. So here it is. And what we'll say is this level represents the sun and or energy input. Usually it's going to be the sun, but if you have an ecosystem like at the sea floor with hydrothermal vents, then perhaps you have something different there as the basis of your energy input. But normally it's the sun, and we're talking solar input around, let's say, we're just going to make up a value, let's say 1,000,000 kcals of energy per square meter. So 1,000,000 kcals, which is what you would find on the back of a package of food, or calories. A kcal is a calorie per meter squared. So then the next trophic level, this actually, I guess, would not technically be a trophic level. This would just be the energy input. But when we step this higher, now we're talking trophic level. And this would be our producers, or what we call autotrophs, that we know are photosynthetic. And what we would see typically from the sun to the autotroph level to the producer level would be about a 1% energy transfer. So we're talking about a 1% energy transfer, right? Because if you think about it, plants, they can use only certain wavelengths. Blue light, red light at 680, 700 nanometers of light. That's a really small amount of the incoming radiation from the sun. Again, plants can only use the visible light part and only at certain wavelengths. So it's only really able to assimilate about 1% of that incoming 1,000,000. So what does that leave us with? That leaves us with about 10,000 kcals of the original million that actually get assimilated, right? And we'll just go ahead and make a note over here. 1 kcal is equal to the energy that it takes to raise 1 kilogram of water 1 degree Celsius. So that's what a kcal is. It's the amount of energy needed to increase a kilogram of water 1 degree Celsius. All right. So from there, we would have what we call our primary consumers. So the things that eat your producers are your primary consumers. So these are heterotrophs, and they are either omnivores or they are herbivores. And again, we're talking a 10% energy transfer here. So 10% energy transfer would be available. So this leaves us with 1,000 kcals. Now, where does the other 90% go? It goes into the nutritional needs and the maintenance needs of these plants that have brought in that energy. They're using the 90% for their metabolic needs within their cell, and then 10% is in tissues, and that's available then to the primary consumer at the next level. We step this up. We talk about then secondary consumers. right? Secondary consumer. We'd be talking about, again, heterotrophs. Carnivores are going to be there at this stage, omnivores as well. And again, if this is 1,000 cows, there's or 1,000 K cows, we have 100 K cows with this 10% transfer. Again, the other 90 has gone into the nutritional needs of the primary consumers. Step this up again, and we're talking about third level consumers. These are tertiary consumers. So again, 10%. So we're looking at about 10K cows. And then finally, you may have a fourth level consumer that we call a quaternary or a fourth level consumer. And again, 10%. So what do we have left? We have 1K cow left in this square meter of space. So what does this mean? It means, well, a couple things. We'll say at the top, so I'll just make some room, and we'll say at the top of this energy pyramid, because there's only 1 kcal left in a square meter, that range, whatever organisms are occupying that feeding step, that range size has to be really large, right? It's got to cover a lot of square meters to meet its nutritional needs, because per square meter, there's only 1 kcal of energy available, and their nutritional needs are going to be greater than that likely. And they may have a lot of feeding options within a food web. So they might feed on a lot of different things to try to meet those nutritional needs. Right, we'll look at an example here. So here's our food web, and we can see that, again, per square meter, once we go up these trophic levels, so 1, 2, or 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, up here at the fourth level with this particular food chain and this food web, the mountain lion, the range has to be really, really large. And they're going to feed on a number of different things to meet their nutritional needs. In fact, the range size of a mountain lion can be up to 100 square meters, anywhere from 5 to 100 square meters, or square miles, not square meters, 5 to 100 square miles, depending on, what's in that particular habitat. Again, the takeaway here is that we have this 10% rule. Where only 10% of energy transfers between your trophic levels. So then the question is, what happens to the other 90%? And we said that much of the 90, so much of that other 90% is used to maintain homeostasis. Maintain homeostasis. And when we'll say maintain by the organism, right? When we talk about endotherms, especially organisms that have to create their own heat by metabolism, to maintain that body temp, this is where that energy is eventually ending up. This 90% is going into the nutritional needs of the cells, but then it becomes heat that helps maintain appropriate body temperature. And as typically the size of an organism decreases, their metabolic rate goes up to meet that body temp requirement, right? Because they've got a smaller body size, so they're going to retain less heat, so they're going to need a higher metabolic rate. Within this trophic level setup in a food web, you may have something called a keystone species. And a keystone species is an organism that has a large effect on the entire structure of a community. And if they are removed, then the stability of that whole community really breaks down. So here's an example of a Pacific Ocean kind of coastline community with sea otters, you have kelp, you have these sea urchins, and then all the fishes and things that would be supported by these kelp forests. So the otters are the keystone species because if they're removed, then the sea urchins will overeat and destroy the kelp forest, and then that essentially is the entire community-based ecosystem there. You're going to lose the whole hatcheries system for the fish, that whole shelter system that the kelp provides. So the sea otters keep the urchins in check, which allows the kelp forest to be maintained. And without the otters, all of this just breaks down. Here's another example with prairie dogs and a prairie ecosystem and all the things that they do to um, prop up and keep this community in a healthy, systematic setup. So we'll go ahead and make a note of these examples where, again, we're talking about, when you look at a food web, there can be some organisms that are these keystone species. So we said the sea otter is one in the kelp kind of forest community. And then you could go prairie dog and the plains or the prairie as well. Lastly, we're going to talk about something called succession. So succession is stepwise change or changes that follows a disturbance in a community. And we're going to look at two different examples of this succession. And really, we're talking about species replacements or replacement that happens over time. So, two different types of succession that occurs. All right, so we'll look at the first variety here is primary succession. And primary succession would be where we begin with little to no soil. So this would be like barren rock that is going to be colonized. There's very few organisms present because there's no soil. So like a volcano and a lava flow covers up ground, and this is kind of what we're beginning with. We'll look at an example. So here's an example of a lava flow that happened sometime in the past, and you're looking at primary succession happening where there really is no soil to speak of, but that we do have these cracks and these fissures that allow just some detritus to start to accumulate and form the first type of soil. And really what's going to happen is you're going to have something called a lichen that will start to grow. It's a algae fungus mutualistic relationship that starts to grow on the rock that will then secrete acids that will start to dissolve the rock, form cracks as the lichens die, and they mix with the sediments. They form just the very first soil. And we call those things the very first things that move into an area we call pioneer species. Here's a picture of what these lichens look like. And then we'll show you one other photo here. So here's that primary succession progression from bare rock to lichens. As those things die, they form the very first soil with the sediments, and you can get then annual plants that need to be replanted and reseeded every year. Then we have more soil, then we get some grasses that come back every year and perennials, and then some shade intolerant trees that don't grow and produce a lot of volume and mass that are quite dense, and then some deep rooted shade tolerant trees like oak and hickory. And that's more of our climax community. And this can take thousands of years. So, key takeaway here is that primary succession, again, it begins with bare rock and it takes a really long time. So, it's a long time progression. And again, we're starting with bare rock. And we'll say that we had this thing that we identified as a pioneer species, and that was really the first species to colonize an area. And we said an example of this were these lichens on this barren rock. So to finish up, we're going to talk here about the second variety called secondary succession. And this is then where you do have soil. So we'll say where soil already exists and you have other species also present. So this is going to cut the timeline down significantly. So here's our example of secondary succession. We have a fire that burns everything to the ground. We have significant soil intact. So the very next year, you're getting regrowth and regeneration because you have soil intact. So any annual type of plant can start to grow. We're going to get grasses and perennials. We're going to get, the shade intolerant species and the shade tolerant species, the mature oak and hickory forest. We can see that burn line and the soil that accumulated, the new soil that accumulated with this turnover in species replacement. And actually, the greatest species richness, resides somewhere with a moderate level of disturbance. So you don't always want climax communities. These, don't necessarily have the best species diversity index. Somewhere in the middle with a moderate amount of disruption is what you want if you're trying to maximize species diversity. So again, just to note this last couple of things you'd be talking about, really your fire and your flood, or something as simple as like a windstorm that pushes over a tract of trees, would do this. And the difference here is it's much, much faster because we have soil that's intact. So your pioneer species are going to be more of the annual plants rather than waiting for lichens to establish that first soil. Finally, the last thing here, at the end, we end up with a climax community. And this is going to be kind of that end stage. So when it's reached, when we reach a climax community, the species replacement really stops. And that community has reached stability. Again, that may not be the best thing, though, in terms of maximizing diversity and species richness. Again, you want some disturbance from time to time to get the woody growth and regeneration that occurs, and then that hosts different populations of herbivores and organisms. So that is community level ecology. I hope that's helpful, and I'll see you next time.